Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's 2:03, so we should get started here. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to students. Welcome to faculty. Welcome to the broader UL community to Harold Holzer's lecture this afternoon. My name is Glenn Crothers, for those of you who don't know me, and I teach U.S. history here at the university. But I'm also a member of the board of Farmington Historic Home, the 1816 Louisville home of the Speed family. Farmington was also a hemp plantation that prospered because of the labor of approximately 70 enslaved people. And in 1841, Abraham Lincoln, the future president, visited Farmington and spent a month recuperating from a romantic misadventure. In 2024, Farmington celebrates its 65th anniversary as a historic site museum, and the board and the staff thought we should do something special to commemorate this milestone. How better than to invite to Louisville the acclaimed Lincoln scholar Harold Holzer. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Farmington, I'd like to offer you a short introduction about the house's present and its future. So, let old man get confused by technology here, and here we go.
Here in America, with homes like Farmington, we have done a great job at saying don't leave. But it is okay to say what happened and invite people in for a deeper conversation. Enslavement is simply a part of Kentucky's history. And so how do we learn about it? Here telling you don't witness it and then walk away. Witness it and come back to Farmington and tell other people. This isn't about tearing down, it's about building up education, understanding, love. It's not about hiding, it's about building us up. We do not grow by tearing Farmington down. We grow by keeping it up and telling the truth. What is the future legacy of Farmington? In 10 years, this will be vibrant and alive. We'll have all the amenities, be it a cidery or having a farm-to-table buffet where we've grown our own food. It becomes a healing place, a place where you have the hard conversations that make sustained change. I feel like Farmington holds space and says, come see me, sit and speak with me. For those who are open to engaging in the conversation, Farmington will be that space.
Beautiful space with a long and tangled history. So Farmington initiated today's lecture, but the support of various university entities have made it possible. So I'd like to thank the McConnell Center, the Department of History, the Department of Communications, and the Brandeis School of Law for their generous support for today's lecture. I'd like to thank, too, the Filson Historical Society for hosting yesterday's luncheon. So, enough thanks, enough of Farmington to our guest. Harold Holzer is director of Hunter College's Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute. He has authored or co-authored or edited 56 books. Makes my wife look like a piker. Including most recently brought forth on this continent, Abraham Lincoln and American Immigration, which was published in 2024. And if you'd like to purchase a copy today, it's available for purchase. And in 2020, he published Presidents versus the Press. In 2015, he won the Gilder Learman Lincoln Prize for Lincoln and the Power of the Press, which was published in 2014. I could say far more about Holzer's accomplishments and scholarship, but I'll instead turn the podium over to him and let him talk today about presidents and the press.
Oh God, everybody's on that side. Okay, I wonder if I can turn this. I'm not going to touch anything. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to do something I've never done in my life, because I've done something I've never done in my life, which is bring the wrong talk, right? But my assistant in New York just forwarded the right talk to me, which is right here. If only I can read it or refer to it. Anyway, like just in the nick of time. So embarrassing. So forgive me. I had too much time on my hands this morning, I think. So I want to start the story actually at a moment that the video covers, a moment when slavery was legal in all of the United States that had not specifically one by one banned slavery. So we're talking obviously about border states like Kentucky and Missouri. Well, let me start in August of 1861, just a month after the Union lost the first battle of the Civil War in the East, one that was widely expected to be won by the Union easily, and that's the Battle of Bull Run. Right then, another bit of concerning news reached Abraham Lincoln in Washington. John Fremont, commander of the Department of the West, that included Missouri and Kentucky, had decided on his own to free enslaved people in his department. And not only did Lincoln not approve of the order, he didn't even know about it. So he had not bothered to notify the president. Lincoln learned the news, like everybody else, from reading the newspapers. Now, Fremont's initiative thrilled the anti-slavery community, but it was a direct challenge to Lincoln's own official and very cautious approach to the slavery issue, not to mention a challenge to his prerogatives as commander-in-chief and president. To Lincoln, Fremont had taken not only a renegade step, but a dangerous step in the broader picture of saving the Union, ultimately. And as he put it, Fremont's order will alarm our Southern friends and turn them against us, particularly in Kentucky. Kentucky was the place Lincoln had recently called the state of my nativity. And it was a place where his longtime friend, as we heard, Joshua Speed, and his brother James, Lincoln's future Attorney General, were working hard to keep this state in the Union, despite significant pro-slavery, pro-Confederate sentiment to secede. And keep in mind, the slavery element was so strong in Kentucky that Lincoln's closest friend of his life, Josh Speed, had not supported him for the presidency. So Lincoln asked Fremont to modify the order so it would confiscate only the property in slaves that belonged to active rebels. Fremont was kind of politically tone-deaf and also very ambitious personally, so he refused. Lincoln had no choice but to revoke the order and ultimately to fire Fremont. As Lincoln explained, I think to lose Kentucky is nearly as much as lose the whole game. If Kentucky is gone, we cannot hold Missouri, nor, as I think, Maryland. But the Fremont affair provoked a huge outcry from the most progressive anti-slavery supporters Lincoln had in journalism. And it came at a time when it was never more true, as Lincoln expressed it. And I've now seen this in 3 newspaper articles in the last week and a new book that's coming out on the Donald Trump trial by my friend Jonathan Alter of Newsweek magazine. Lincoln said, public opinion is everything. He who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces decisions. So it must have worried Lincoln greatly that the pro-Republican press, and please keep in mind that the press was openly partisan in the run-up to the war and in the early days and through the war. Every major city, Louisville included, had a Republican newspaper and a Democratic newspaper. New York had a few of each. And the New York Tribune and New York Times were both Republican papers. They rarely complemented each other, either complemented with an I or complemented with an E. But in this case, they both attacked Lincoln for overturning Fremont's emancipation order, to which was added the kind of haunting lament by the black press in New York, and I'll quote the New York Anglo-African, which is a terrific and I think a digitized source for black opinion during the Civil War. They said that the defeat at Bull Run was a slight affair compared with the order of Lincoln, which hurls back into the hell of slavery thousands who were rightfully set free by General Fremont. Lincoln held his ground. He wanted to control the timing and the breadth of emancipation on his own. And yet he knew, as he put it, confided to a friend, that the proclamation of Fremont brings us to a new chapter in the War of the Rebellion. Even if the chapter had no clear ending, Lincoln was determined that he alone should be the one to write the opening passage when he was ready. And here's the irony. What would end first was not slavery, but Lincoln's tolerance for that kind of press criticism. That's my roundabout way of getting into the topic. At this point, in the North as well of the South, and by the South I mean those parts where the Union had partial or full control, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, and Delaware, the Lincoln administration cracked down hard at first, not against slavery, but against dissent. And that's the surprising story I want to focus on this evening. Let me pause for some background again. It would take a whole lecture just to reimagine the press culture of the mid-19th century. People regarded their newspapers with the same kind of passion that the students regard their social media. I mean, they were passionate about newspapers. I'm not being patronizing. I mean, I sound patronizing, but I don't mean to be. I love when people hunger for information. And that meant getting morning papers, afternoon papers. Republicans read Republican papers only, unfortunately, and Democrats read Democratic papers only. So it's a little bit like the dichotomy between viewers of Fox and MSNBC. I'm just talking about my generation. Today, they're not only communicating about politics, they're communicating, I guess, about Taylor Swift and the World Series, which is certainly what I'm communicating about starting tomorrow night. But in the 19th century, it was really extraordinarily devoted to politics. Sure, there were newspapers that serialized novels. Charles Dickens was enormously popular in American serialization, and everyone wanted to know about local stuff and crime, not much different than today, but politics was it. And maybe it wasn't instantaneous like it is today. Interestingly, as I said when we were in the car, here at the McConnell Center, the social media and the Associated Press just broke the story that an authorized biography of Leader McConnell is coming out in the next week. And see, some people are nodding. They've seen the story, that he has come out very critically against the MAGA movement and President Trump. Now, in the 19th century, you'd have to wait till the next day to get that. But people who got the news the next day said, isn't this amazing? Our newspapers used to come out twice a week. And even if I'm an old guy like me, I remember they used to come out once a week. Now they come out every day except Sunday. So we can get the news breathtakingly fast. Why? Steam presses had been invented, and the telegraph, of course, transported news rather quickly. So newspapers were considered just as immediate as we consider the social media of the 21st century. Lincoln was part of this world. He edited campaign newspapers, specials they were called. He, as a young man, wrote anonymous or pseudonymous editorials for the Whig paper in New Salem, Illinois. And later, when he moved to the state capitol, he became very close to the Whig paper that became a Republican paper. Where was he when the news came that he was nominated for president? He was sitting in the office of the Republican newspaper, just as Stephen Douglas was hanging out during his convention at the Springfield's Democratic paper. Newspaper writing was not a benign business. The legend makers would have us believe that Lincoln leaned against a Cracker Barrel and read Shakespeare, maybe he did, but he also, and his stepmother attested to this, voraciously read newspapers from an early age as a teenager. He read the St. Louis Democrat. Of course, that was an anti-democratic paper. He did not read the St. Louis Republican, which was the Democratic paper. Don't even ask. But that goes back to Jeffersonian days when it was Republican Democrat. But he read Republican newspapers. And this is like a crossover story to my immigration book and story. In 1859, Lincoln had just campaigned in Ohio and Kansas for Republican candidates, all of whom won. Republicans won in Pennsylvania. It's a year from the presidential election. Lincoln is, he knows that the local Springfield paper will support him, the Republican paper. He knows the Chicago Tribune, the big paper in the state, will support him, just as he knows the Chicago Times will go to any lengths to destroy him. And he thinks he's going to win the state because of the German vote. All of a sudden, he's invited to speak at a convention of Germans. He doesn't go, but he sends a letter. The German officials are very happy. And then the official who organized this meeting comes to him and says, Mr. Lincoln, I'm about to open a German language newspaper here in Springfield to spread to the whole state. Lincoln says, that's wonderful, you have my blessing. And he said, I'm making up this dialogue. And he says, well, I can't do it because my creditors just seized my printing press. So I need $500 to get it out of hock. Lincoln gave him $500, made him sign a contract that if he was true to Republican platforms for up until December 1860, keep that date in mind, it's like when the votes are certified for president, then he didn't even have to pay back the loan and he could keep the printing press. Lincoln, who could not read German, as far as I know, he knew only one German word. Even though he took classes, not as serious as you students, he cut up in the classes so much that people complained that nobody could learn anything because he was telling jokes. But he did know that there was an editor named George Schneider in Chicago who owned his own German paper, and allegedly Lincoln once said to him, Schneider, I know what that means in English, it's tailor. So we know he got one word out of his German lessons. He owned this paper, and he kept it secret. He owned it for a year and a half. And by the way, as I mentioned to I think yesterday at the Filson, no one has ever found a copy of this paper. Lincoln had them quietly purchased by the state legislature after he was elected. So if anybody has an attic and it has old newspapers from the pre-war era, the Illinois Staatsanzeiger, you have to know how to read fracture German type, but we could finance graduate education and all that stuff, opening your first law office, so look for it. Anyway, after Lincoln is a newspaper owner, he is a newspaper suppressor. Back in '61, Bull Run, Fremont, Lincoln, who has always embraced newspapers, owned the newspaper, as I said. Instances occurred that had become quite famous in terms of shutting down the press. And I'm not today going to address the big cases that many people know about. General Burnside shutting down the Chicago Times in 1863, and Lincoln personally signing an order to shut down 2 newspapers in New York City in June, just days before the Republican convention was going to meet to renominate him. He still shut down 2 papers for the mysterious reason of printing a presidential proclamation that was fake. I can get into it more in the Q&A. But I want to talk about the censorship that took place right at this moment of Fremont and the proclamation. because that's when the first 90 and 100-day Union volunteers were seeing that their original period of service ending. And Lincoln was kind of in a panic. We were supposed to win Bull Run. Maybe the Battle of Wilson's Creek out here was supposed to be won, and the war would be over. Secession would be over. Well, that's not what happened. And now these soldiers are going home, and newspapers in their hometowns are, at least the Democratic ones, are writing, you did your bit, the administration messed up, come home, resume your jobs, go back to your families. You know, nothing more is expected of you. And this is while Lincoln is petitioning these same men to please re-enlist for 6 months, for a year, for 3 years. So his position became, you know, he had to evaluate the fine line between dissent and what he regarded as treason. And, you know, we're hearing a lot of the same talk today in terms of the internet and crackdowns and oversight or complete freedom. It's an argument we're still having. Lincoln had no doubt about what his position should be. First, the military took control of the entire telegraph system in the United States. Telegraphy in Washington had been located on 14th Street, where all the newspapers had capital headquarters, you know, Washington bureaus, that's the word. The telegraph was there too. It was now moved into the War Department. That's why there were stories of Lincoln going to the War Department during the war to get news, because they moved the telegraph there, not because the War Department had a telegraph at the beginning. Then commerce was banned in and out of the rebellious states, meaning newspapers could not come from the South, and they could not go from the North to the South. And there were test cases. The first I want to tell you about is a paper called The Christian Observer, published in Philadelphia. Very pro-secession paper. Its editor, after Bull Run, accused Union forces of what he called gross, brutal, fiendish, demonic outrages meant to ravage the country, pillage the houses, outrage the women, and shoot children for amusement. Fake news, obviously. And Converse's paper was no danger in Pennsylvania because it was a strong Union state. But that paper also circulated into Maryland, which was a border state with secession proclivities. So on August 22nd, right at the same time Lincoln was overriding Fremont, federal forces invaded the Christian Observer. And they did much better than they did at Bull Run. They confiscated the paper, and Converse, protesting to Lincoln that freedom of the press is inviolable, Lincoln just ignored him. Converse fled to Richmond. The censorship wave struck New York City, my hometown, as well. And people don't realize that Democratic papers were harassed in the North as early as the fall of 1861. In mid-August, a federal grand jury asked whether certain newspapers who were engaged in what they called encouraging the rebels in arms should not have force brought upon them to overcome them. And the jury foreman identified the papers that he had in mind, including one paper called the Daily News, not the same as, for those of you who know the New York press, not the same as today's Daily News. It was actually a paper owned by the brother of the mayor of New York, and it was created to help the mayor. And the mayor's position at the time was that New York should secede from the Union and become a free international state. And by free, he meant free to trade with the slaveholding South. And the News had editorialized that if the national government interfered with states' rights, every citizen was absolved by God from the social obligation to obey. The federal judge never ruled, but the Postmaster General banned 5 New York newspapers from the mails. Think about that. They're forbidden to mail papers. When the News tried subverting that order by shipping copies by rail, government agents boarded trains and threw the papers off the trains and destroyed them. So the news closed down, and its editor turned to writing novels about life in military prisons. The mayor did better. He wound up as a congressman and a character in Spielberg's Lincoln movie as a congressman from New York. The Brooklyn Eagle also was pro-secession. They apologized in print and fired its managing editor after the Union Army visited the newspaper and ousted the editor. They wrote editorials saying that they apologized. And they proclaimed the pretense that we desire to subjugate anybody but the rebels is now amply refuted. Until then, afterwards, the paper was reliably pro-Lincoln. And some tried to resist. There was a paper called the New York Freeman's Journal, which was incredibly racist and pro-slavery. Its editor was arrested and brought to Washington and imprisoned for 11 weeks in the old Capitol prison. Censorship hysteria in the North metastasized. A grand jury in New Jersey named 5 disloyal papers. Mobs attacked newspapers, Democratic papers in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Returning Union soldiers set fire to a Democratic paper in Bangor, Maine. And in Haverhill, Massachusetts, a Democratic editor was actually tarred and feathered on the street as his typeface. I don't know if young people know what typeface is, but they used to set line by line on trays with letter by letter. They were all thrown into the street. The War Department put the icing on the cake by ordering that any communication about military movements anywhere in the country sent not only by telegraph, but in the mail, I don't know how they were going to find that out, that respected military movements is illegal. 154 more Democratic papers were put on this informal but chilling watch list. And as I said, editors face more peril, more understandably, in the border states who were teetering between loyalty and secession. In Missouri, one young, untested brigadier general tried to make his bones to General Fremont by alerting him, I've just arrested an editor, and I picked up his printing press, and I'm bringing it back to St. Louis as a kind of trophy. Guess who he was? Ulysses S. Grant. That was his early action against the Confederacy. He ordered the shutdown of another paper, the Boonville Patriot. He told his troops, bring all the printing material with him, arrest the editor, bring him with you, and bring some copies of the paper that he edits. He's no more entitled to free speech than any obnoxious Confederate sympathizer. Then a week later, he's arresting more editors. It's astonishing. Meanwhile, in St. Louis, the Missourian and the St. Louis War Bulletin are both shut down. The St. Louis Christian Advocate is shut down. The St. Louis Evening News. One Democrat in Missouri writes to the Postmaster General, we're under a reign of terror. Will our president countenance such tyranny? Well, Postmaster General sent that letter to Lincoln, but Lincoln did not indicate on the back of the letter whether he was interested in the argument or not. His silence spoke volumes. So more St. Louis papers and small papers in Missouri. Now let me tell you a little bit about Maryland. Censorship there began when a paper called the Baltimore Exchange editorialized that the War of the South is a war of the people and by the people. I often wonder if Lincoln ever read that, right? Maybe he didn't invent the phrase. There are actually 2 other roots of the people, by the people. I'm going to Gettysburg in 3 weeks, but I'm not going to tell them that the phrase may have originated in an anti-Union Baltimore paper. But the War of the North says the paper is a war of party carried out by political schemers. So federal authorities respond to this by closing the paper and arresting its editor. His name is Francis Key Howard. And they threw him into confinement without trial. This was the norm. These people aren't put in front of a jury or a judge. They're just no habeas corpus. They are just arrested by the military and put in military facilities. And he, Francis Key Howard, was put in Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. Does anyone know what the irony of that is? Anybody guess? His grandfather was Francis Scott Key, and he actually saw the bombs bursting in the air, inspiring him to write the national anthem, what became the national anthem. And here is his grandson. Two of his grandsons were Confederate sympathizers, but this one is in Fort McHenry looking out, not outside, looking in. Was the younger Kelly guilty of treason, or was he just exercising freedom of the press, freedom of speech guaranteed in the Constitution? That's the question. Lincoln argued that you can't save a limb and kill the body. That was his homey way of expressing why some constitutional provisions could be abdicated in times of rebellion, which the Constitution also says, to save the greater good. Anyway, 4 of Baltimore other papers are suppressed, and as Lincoln says, are all the laws but one to go unexecuted and the government itself go to pieces lest that one be violated? He accused the rebel editors of insidious debauching of the public mind. He could perform this duty, closing down the dissenters, or surrender the existence of the government. And we still debate his exercise of unprecedented control over the press. I mean, we can talk about Wilson and Roosevelt in the 2 world wars, but this was extraordinary. By the way, Republican editors, the more progressive editors, and one might have thought they would rise up and say, this is the principle we're fighting for, freedom. But they didn't. The New York Times said no right of the press should shield it from the penalty of a crime against society. The Times was surprised only that, as they put it, the administration has so long forborne to defend itself against the fanatical and insurrectionary crusade of the secession papers published in the so-called loyal states. The Times editor's only complaint was that it cost the government millions of dollars to muzzle the opposition, the organs of treason, as he said. They must be destroyed. So that brings me and the story at last to Kentucky, and one case that should be of particular interest in Louisville, because inevitably suppression fever, not secession fever, suppression fever spread here as well. Because Union loyalty in many parts of the state remained a minority viewpoint, and Lincoln, again relying on the advice of the Speed family to tamp down secession sympathy, feels he has to act. In September 1861, just a month after the outbreaks in Missouri, a Union loyalist set a crackdown in motion by sending Secretary of State William Seward a batch of recent editorials from the Louisville Courier, a paper that New York editor Horace Greeley called a secession press. So this is what the writer writes to Seward. Isn't it about time that the editor of this paper was an occupant of Fort Lafayette, that was a huge prison in New York Harbor, or some other suitable place for traitors? The people are getting tired of sending their sons to fight rebels, while such as this editor, more mischievous by far than if he was armed with muskets, are allowed to furnish and comfort the enemy unmolested. On the 18th, the U.S. Post Office obliged by banning the Louisville Courier from the U.S. mails, but it was just the beginning. On the 19th, just one day later, authorities raided the newspaper's offices and took several employees into custody, including the man I describe as the assistant editor, Reuben Durrett, whose name I just learned to pronounce yesterday at the Filson, whom the Filson describes as a former editor. But I would suggest, just based on the paperwork of his arrest, that he considered himself an editor at the time. He was certainly a co-owner of the paper. And he was charged with publishing editorials of treasonable character. It was not a banner day for free speech in Kentucky. Also seized as a traitor that day was the state's former governor, Charles Moorhead, and another journalist who allegedly used his position as a telegraph agent to transport messages about the enemy. So the case of the ex-governor dominated coverage. Obviously, he was the celebrity, the big guy, who was arrested that day. But because Durrett was linked to his detention, it became one of the first press censorship cases that Lincoln ultimately did get involved with, not, alas, sympathetically. The Courier had a racist but pro-union owner named George Prentice, who was a real charmer. He quickly said he had nothing to do with the editorial, but really Prentice didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't a secessionist. He's never done any harm in the community. I'd rather give a remnant of the brief time left in my life than see his confinement protracted. Lincoln was unmoved. He scribbled on the back, "Sent to Fort Lafayette by the military authorities of Kentucky would be improper for me to intervene without any further knowledge of the case than I now possess." So think of it. Reuben Durrett, future founder of the Filson, is sent from Louisville to Brooklyn to languish in Fort Lafayette, by at that time the most notorious military prison in the United States, without a bill of habeas corpus, without a formal charge, without a hearing. Well, further information did get to Lincoln, but not of a helpful character. It came from pro-union Kentucky Democrat Joseph Holt, former Secretary of War under Buchanan, and now working to keep his home state from seceding like the Speeds. He told Lincoln that Durrett had done everything in his power to incite the people of Kentucky to take up arms against the government. His arrest has rejoiced the hearts of Union men, and his discharge would be a fatal mistake. By the way, there's no record from Speed on what, if anything, he thought of Durrett's arrest. Holt enclosed, to just be even less helpful, he enclosed some of Durrett's editorials so Lincoln could read them. And according to Holt, Durrett had believed there was no obligation for Kentucky to remain in the Union. It was clear what Lincoln thought about the report because he rewarded Holt by making him the Judge Advocate General of the United States. Durrett's friends did not abandon him. They pressed for his release through other channels. In October, they wrote to the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, saying Durrett was a harmless man who hardly knew which side he was on. Then they petitioned Lincoln again by saying that his family was facing financial ruin if he wasn't released. Only then, and this is months later, did Lincoln finally tell Seward, "I'm willing, if you are, that any of the parties may be released, but only if James Speed agreed here in Louisville." Nothing happens. Around Christmas time, Durrett writes to Secretary Seward himself, protests his innocence, and bitterly complain about conditions in prison. And only at Christmas time was his case finally reopened. Seward finally ordered his release, providing he sign a document that he would not do anything further hostile to the United States. He swore to an oath of allegiance, and just before Christmas, he became a free man and returned to Louisville after 10 weeks inside a series of federal prisons. And only after publisher Prentice reminded Lincoln of the importance of his newspaper in continuing the fight for Kentucky to stay in the Union. By the way, Prentice also added that if you really want Kentucky to stay in the Union, you would do more government advertising in my newspaper so I could make more money out of this whole deal. Few episodes better illustrate the dangers that faced border state and other Democratic editors who opposed Lincoln and opposed the Union, or the rewards expected by men like Prentice who supported them. At least Lincoln could console himself by writing, "I understand the Kentucky arrests were not made by special direction from here," meaning the White House or Washington, D.C. Small solace to Durrett, who was still languishing in prison when his employer began securing his new round of lucrative government ads and deals. So in return, as we know, Kentucky remained nominally in the Union. The Kentucky native who occupied the White House won a second term and won the war. And then the U.S. Supreme Court declared that all of his press suppression activities were unconstitutional after Lincoln died. And there could be no further comment, at least with him. He remained during this period fully aware of the power of the press not only to report, but to shape events, convinced of his own power to mold public sentiment, or, where appropriate, to crush dissent. If nothing else, all these kind of chilling stories about the uncivil war over the press should make our own modern-day debate about partisan journalism and suppression and freedoms sound kind of like malice toward none compared to what was happening to dissenting editors during the Civil War. We sometimes forget how long we have debated media freedom and censorship in the United States. Press suppression may not have been Lincoln's greatest achievement by far, but he would argue that it helped save the Union, because dissent at that point meant secession. Secession meant dissolution of the Union. And there would be further rounds of pushback against the press. As I mentioned, in 1863 in Chicago, in 1864 in New York. I even found a case of a pushback against the press in New England in 1865 when the war was all but won and the 13th Amendment had already been ratified by the House and sent to the states. Again, not Lincoln's finest hour, but perhaps in what Lincoln called the hour of trial, a decisive factor in putting down the rebellion. That debate continues as well, and I'd love to open it up questions so we can debate it. Thank you. I hope you're all impressed. This is the first time I've ever done this, and it kind of worked. I blew it up to large type, but it worked. Anyway, is there time for a few questions? Okay. Who's got questions about pushback against the press or anything? Yes?
So I know you talked about St. Louis, but did you find any pushback across the river in Alton, Illinois? Because I know Alton was big.
That's a great question, because Alton was, of course, the place where Elijah Lovejoy had published an abolitionist paper, he having moved around both sides of the river to find a hospitable place, but ultimately Lovejoy was killed on the banks of the river, and his printing press was thrown onto the embankment and kicked into the river. By the way, the editor who I mentioned early in the conversation, who owned the German newspaper that the creditors had seized and that Lincoln invested in, had originally had a German paper in Alton. He wasn't killed, but he was sort of run out of town. That's why his printing press was on the road all the way up to Springfield. And the answer about the other side of the river, the non-slave side, is that there was suppression in Indiana and Illinois as well. It's all in the book. All through the war, newspapers, small newspapers, middle-sized newspapers in Illinois were also subject to closure at the whim of commanding officers. And Fremont, when he was in command in the West, was censorship happy. Grant was censorship happy when he took over the West. And in the middle of them all, General Burnside, who stupidly closed the Chicago Times, that was probably the most egregious and unnecessary and provocative closing. And it's the one closing of a Democratic newspaper. And you have to keep in mind that this paper had been brutal to Lincoln during the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates and when he was a presidential candidate. It was partially owned by his arch rival, Stephen Douglas, who by then had been dead for 2 years. But, Lincoln must have, in one part of his brain, thought, this is sweet justice to close this paper. But on the other side of his brain was that there were too many people in Chicago who believed in free press, and that was the one order he personally revoked, and very quickly, when it became a political liability. So yeah, all through the other side of the Ohio and Mississippi, there was suppression. Yeah.
I suppose on that same note, my same address, which Lincoln gave, partially inspired by Lovejoy's murder. He talks a lot about how the threat of mob rule, particularly the mob rule targeting the free press. Have you found any sort of justification, any reasoning, any why Lincoln thought there was a way to distinguish between the mob rule in the 1840s with Lovejoy and what was happening?
Yeah, you have to, yeah, so he, thanks. Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you at the end. So he's talking about a speech that Lincoln made at a church in Springfield before a club called the Young Men's Lyceum, which was kind of a club for elites to show off for each other and give lectures on interesting topics. So Lincoln talked about the institutions of the country and the face-off between tradition and George Washington's example of leadership and mob rule. The fact that if a Caesar comes to conquer us, it will be from within. And against the mobocratic spirit of the times. It's very widely quoted every time there's a presidential election. Everybody says, oh, this guy is just who he was warning against. No, that guy is who he was warning against. And it's not a great speech. It's really the early, he's trying to think of how old he was, 38 or 39 when he gave it. He's a little more florid, much more florid than he is in his great addresses of 20 years later in Illinois, and of course the great brief, poetic presidential addresses. But, and some think that it was, I mean, psychobiographers have said that speech is simply his attack on his father, who he couldn't stand. But, so it's been not only politically and historically analyzed, but psychoanalyzed as well. And I think that the attack on Lovejoy is there if you look for it. It's subtle, it's deep in the text, but he talks about editors being attacked and killed by mobs. He also talks about lynching. It's about the only time he ever talked about lynching. In New York City, in the riots against the draft in July of 1863, black men were lynched, they were sexually mutilated, they were dragged through the streets, they were set on fire, and they were strung from ropes. Lincoln never mentioned it as an outrage, but he did in the case of people who were traveling in the South and advocating abolition and were lynched, white people. So, and actually some who were people of color as well. So it's a remarkable speech, and yes, he is advocating against mobocratic spirit, but giving no hint of the fact that one of his answers to violation of government authority was to crack down on newspapers 25 years later. So you're all cool with shutting down newspapers? No, there's a question there.
Could you talk about I didn't hear, did you say that his decisions were found unconstitutional or constitutional? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't articulate that. Yeah, the court heard a challenge after his death, and interestingly, the opinion was written by his old friend and traveling companion and Supreme Court appointee David Davis, who, unlike Joshua Speed, never shared a bed with Lincoln because he weighed 350 pounds. And when they traveled from inn to inn on the judicial circuit, Davis always got his own bed, even if people had to sleep on the floor in the rooms they shared, because he was a threat to roll over or something. And he expected to be kind of a power player in Washington from the beginning. He was Lincoln's campaign manager. They were very close, but he did not reward him with a job. And Davis was very angry. Maybe that was in the back of his head. Although when there was a second Supreme Court vacancy, there were a few vacancies because Southerners left the court, although Lincoln didn't immediately fill their seats because he hoped, against hope, that they would return to loyalty to the country. But he ultimately appointed to the Supreme Court the man who would write the opinion saying his crackdown on the press was not supportable.
So, this goes out of that time period a little bit, but the court upholds the treatment of the press and stuff during World War I.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Gee, no, we shouldn't be surprised when courts don't pay attention to stare decisis and they make new rulings, right? We've seen a few of those in the last couple of years. World War I case was much more credited on not the enemy within, but the enemy outside. So Wilson's argument was any violation of the rules that he set forth in his Committee for Public Information, the CPI, was subject to arrest and shut down. And editors were put in jail in World War I as well. And FDR tried to recreate the CPI. I mean, he was in Washington during World War I as an Assistant Secretary of the Navy, FDR, and he, did the same thing as Wilson did. He engaged, he produced posters, he produced propaganda, he got the country's leading movie directors to do films about, the Allied effort, and so, at least in 3 major wars, there's been both propaganda and censorship. Propaganda with Lincoln was more indirect because there was a government printing office, brand new government printing office, but it was kind of an infant organization, and Lincoln didn't take much advantage of it. But in the famous letter he wrote defending censorship against the press and restrictions on free speech, it was published all over the country in pamphlets by union leagues and by local Republican clubs. So it did circulate as a piece of propaganda. Must I shoot a simple-minded soldier boy who deserts and spare the head of the wily agitator who induces him to desert? That was his argument. Of course, he didn't have to spare the head of the wily agitator. It's a great line. Yeah?
After the death of President Lincoln, how did the press portray him and his role as the president during the Civil War? I know you said that they were pretty partisan, so were they pretty similar?
Yeah, that's a great question. And my friend, Professor Martha Hodes of NYU, wrote a wonderful book called Mourning Lincoln that shows how anyone who, either on the street or in print, who suggested, why are you so sad? Remember what this guy did was, subject to violent pushback. Or you don't see any evidence in the press of rejoicing. I mean, very, very rare. And honestly, people thought that he was the best potential source for leadership on reconciliation, both sectional and racial. So his loss was felt, I think, genuinely by people who thought, the same people who thought he was a tyrant in the re-election campaign of '64 for this kind of suppression, I think mourned, and the sheer violence of it was so horrifying that, yes, Democratic and Republican papers alike, and even Southern papers, such as were left, and one of the casualties of the war in the South as the bedrocks, the foundational elements of this Confederate slave era culture were destroyed with everything else, was the newspaper system. So newspapers had just gone under, editors had been drafted, and there was really not much of a publishing industry left in the Confederacy. But yeah, pretty unanimous mourning. It's a good question. Yes?
In terms of today's money, how much would newspapers cost during that time?
That's a good question. The big revolution was the penny press of the 1830s. The old New York Sun was the first penny press. So they were 1 or 2 cents. Listen, I remember newspapers were less than 5 cents when I was a little boy. I used to go to the store to get papers for my parents, and they were 3 cents, They weren't making their money in circulation. They were making their money in political advertising. Are you really from Plattsburgh?
No, my wife went to school there.
Okay.
When
If you think it got chilly today, all you have to do is go to Plattsburgh. I'm sure it's 30 degrees there.
But yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I had a newspaper out and they sold for $0.25.
I had a newspaper route for about a week. We lived in a very hilly area. It was not for me. I did the book instead. But yeah, I mean, look, the newspaper culture is so different today. The New York Times prints things 2 and 3 days after running them online. They absolutely don't care about the print edition anymore, which was once so, eagerly looked at in the morning. I still get it in the morning, but I read it online as well, so a lot of old stuff by the time I get it. But yeah, the 1 cent, 2 cents in the pre-war period and through the war. In the South, the papers became unaffordable because of, and you can read this in the advertisements of the papers that survived, they had no paper. So the famous newspapers of Vicksburg, the last gasp of opposition to Ulysses S. Grant, were actually published on the back of wallpaper. And there are still copies around of the last edition of the Vicksburg, I can't remember the name of it, printed on one side, on the non-wallpaper side, saying Grant's arrival is near, abandon the city, and then there's a little item on the bottom, the general is here and dining in the city, which I take to mean that one of the soldiers was a former typesetter and he just put in the last story and got it run. There are some copies around in many historical societies, but that's what it came down to. Shortages of ink and ink, writers, illustrators, and paper. Okay, thank you.